gives me great pleasure to welcome onto this episode of the segment Carlos Buenano, CTO for OT at Armis, the leaders in OT security. Carlos, welcome to the segment.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure to be here.
Oh, I think the pleasure is all mine because we're into season 2 of the podcast, and if my recollection is correct, I think this is the first episode where we've had someone who is an expert in OT security, which is so top of mind these days. So I think the path into OT security is not a natural one when people think about careers in information security. So tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm a electronic engineer. I specialize in control systems. I remember going to university and having that one subject, control systems, and I got hooked. So programming my PLC, configuring a SCADA server, and pulling information, connecting to sensors and actuators, and making the automation happen.
Mm-hmm.
It got me hooked from the very beginning. Throughout my career, I developed basically the skills to be a control systems engineer. I remember the time where networking was actually part of the transition between serial networks and Ethernet networks.
Mm-hmm.
And I got very curious about it. And I wanted to be part of it, part of that transition, and then mixing the whole networking and control systems into one. And then I started designing control networks,
mm-hmm.
Which was actually quite interesting. And slowly, was actually, going more into, configuring PLCs, SCADA servers, DCSs, going into networking, programming and defining control networks. Come across with ISC 62443 and how defined, network segmentation from a greenfield point of view. And slowly starting getting involved with systems, Active Directories, EDRs, and integrating all these different systems, joining all these systems into the domain and protecting these devices and, backing them up and making sure I have the procedures in place, following ISC 62443 at the time. And, it's almost like I just fell into it. And in the last 10 years, I've been focusing only in cybersecurity for OT environments. My understanding of, the environment, the OT environment as such, and communicating with the OT personnel, the engineering teams, the plant managers, and giving them, the information that they need to hear, because it can actually be a very, very complex conversations with the plant managers, because we want to protect the production, and then we need to start introducing security topics. It is actually one of our pleasures.
I love that. Thank you for that, because I think it's fascinating that you're someone whose background is an expertise in control systems, and
Correct.
Which means that when you have these conversations with sort of plant managers, etc., today, you're able to have those conversations with a very informed perspective.
Well, I was the one person behind the laptop programming the PLCs, plugging the cables. So I understand exactly what the plant managers have to go for, and to maintain production, to maintain safety of the people while doing so.
So just want to go back to sort of your time when you were studying, during your time studying engineering. Did you think, when you're studying control systems, at that point, did you think about security?
No, never. All my focus was actually always automation. How to automate, and of course we used to get involved with the vendors, Rockwell, Siemens, for instance, Schneider, and learn their tools, learn the way, the most efficient way to perform the automation. When you come to OT systems, there is also a hierarchy of, internally, you have the process engineers that define what basically the plants need to do, how they need to behave, what is expected from an automation point of view. But then you have the control systems engineer. They need to be structured in understanding all the narrative produced by the process engineers, and then put that in place, and then design and implement that. Then you think about other things. You think about standards. You think about ways to program, templates to program these systems, so that the next person that comes from maintenance need to do what they need to do to maintain it, understood, very well documented. So you're actually focusing more in the implementation of these control systems, and you use then what is available. You use the network, you plug the network, you're giving an IP address. If you have it's a network, or you're giving an ID number if you have a serial network, and then you have the gateways and how they communicate, and you configure the SCADA server with different tags to pull information. This is it's a big world of knowledge that you have to implement during the implementation of these systems. So there's almost no space to to think about security. Really, is the whole thing is about making it work. It's like any other project. You have a project manager, and it's all about time and effort dedicated to deliver that specific project. When you are in operations, it's all about meeting the requirements from production perspective, and ensuring that the devices are actually working as they're supposed to be working. You don't think about the communication, because one of the main requirements in OT networks is to communicate the devices that need to be communicating to. Okay, you don't think about I found an application that I want to add more options when it comes to a new tool, so that you can actually use it. And no, this is actually, you have a PLC, you have an HMI, you have a SCADA server, you have a network that connect them, the three, and once they're connected, don't touch it. That's it. It's working. You need to actually go through a very strict management of change, just to make sure that whatever changes are made are validated, are actually approved by the plant managers, and then they are not going to affect negatively in the performance of the network. So that's why it's like, okay, once it's designed, you have a person that designed that control network. With that, later on, I was that person, and then once it's designed, to be able to change it, you have to have a really specific reason to change it.
Understood. And thank you for that very detailed explanation. I'm going to paraphrase, so apologize for sort of trivializing it a lot. But I think to summarize, it's like the priority in those control systems is keeping the plant operational, keeping it efficient, keeping it safe, right? Kind of those, if I think about those are the priorities. So, and if I kind of marry this to sort of, let's say, like an application development environment, right? It's kind of like the application team care about sort of availability, reliability of their application. And it's almost, if those are compromised, the security, they're like, well, if the application doesn't work, who cares about security? So how do you have that? So now kind of bringing it to your role today, how do you have that conversation with the plant managers or whoever you engage with at sort of in your engagements, to walk them through how you can introduce security that they need in the right way that doesn't compromise the things that they most care about?
Yeah, so that's a very tough conversation. Plant managers, engineering teams are very protective of the networks. Okay. However, there is a concern around, basically validating the performance, the design of the networks. Okay, the communications that these networks are actually exposed to. So there are two methods, I guess, two strategies.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, what is it for me? What is it
Mm-hmm.
for me as a plant manager? How
Mm-hmm.
can I actually, what would I want? Starting with visibility, what I would, I already have my inventories. I understand what the device is supposed to be doing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start with that. You start like, okay, so are your inventories, up to date? Do you
Mm-hmm.
understand, what devices you have
Mm-hmm.
running that are end of life that can,
Mm-hmm.
potentially affect your production? Can you really be sure that these devices are in fact doing what they're supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have any misconfigurations. Um, you know, uh, you know, who is actually making changes of your system, of your PLCs? Are you aware of when they're actually in fact making the changes? So the approach is actually more about, hey, these are the benefits that introducing a security system is going to bring you, and is going to basically facilitate, some of the processes that you have to work on, and then perhaps I know the most efficient, and then understand the pain points. And I give you a very, very specific example. One of our customers in the engineering team, they asked me, okay, well, I've got a problem with an IP address. I'm trying to deploy this device on the network, and it says that it's got a clashing IP address and I can't find it. And then, it turns out that, someone else came in and, introduced another device, used the IP address that was free in their spreadsheet and didn't update the spreadsheet. And the other person came in and is like, well, I wanted to use that. And then they came and used the visibility platform, and then tapped the IP address and found the two devices.
Mm-hmm.
And then the plant manager is like, is that simple? That used to take me weeks to figure it out how. And then once you actually, expose that benefit, it's like, okay, tell me more. What else can I do? So that's how, it is, it's not, I can't actually tell you a straight answer in terms of what is the recipe, but I can tell you the ideas of, okay, get them involved, and, help them understand that the security platforms that you use also is gonna bring some benefits, and then highlight the benefits on their side, because the security part, I have to admit, they're not going to be interested in, because they're not going to provide benefit. It's going to provide benefit to the whole organization as such, but not specifically to their team.
That's fantastic. The IP address tracking via spreadsheet story is funny because it does take me back to my days on the customer side, right? And those spreadsheets are whoever holds the keys to the spreadsheet is king or queen.
Exactly.
But I think I love how you describe that. It's really bringing. It's not forcing the agenda about, oh, you need to secure, but it's about showing them maybe things that they're not seeing or they don't know, right? And
Correct.
that, as you said, like that aha moment, like, oh my god, right? Is it that easy? And I've been struggling with this for ages, but I kind of want to, like, I think one of the things you touched on very lightly was around sort of the amount of legacy infrastructure in OT environments, right? And kind of we hear this a lot about how much sort of very old versions of Windows, etc., continue to run because they're so critical. Like going back to what we were saying earlier about how important they are to running that safely. How do you resolve that?
Yeah. So let's just tell the story first, right? So why do we have so many legacy systems in OT environments, right? So when you're actually involved in a project, a greenfield project, the first requirement is the lifespan of this, whatever we're building, this plant, this production line or whatever it is 30 years. That's the first requirement, okay? Because it's a multi-billion-dollar investment that they need to make sure that they have to expand as long as possible. Okay, so when we actually enter at the moment into an environment, we can actually see that there is a lot of legacy systems. So that's the first challenge. So that we have devices that are running, Windows 10, Windows NT. I'm not kidding. Some systems are actually running serial interfaces. Some devices are the end of life is actually years, and that imposes a risk. It has happened to me where I was actually part of the engineering team, and one production line failed, and we went and tried to resolve the issue and figure out that the card that failed, that digital input card that failed, it was end of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been end of life for 10 years. And because they are designed so well, so robust, they can actually last for years and years and years until they fail. The problem is that we went to the stores and we couldn't find a spare part because the last spare parts were used. And then, of course, we went to the vendor. Hey, we need an emergency delivery of this specific card. And guess what? We don't have it. We stopped producing it, ages ago. So what do you do, right? Because to replace the equipment itself, it takes a coordinated project, okay? Because you need to understand what do you need to change it to and so forth, right? And we ended up, believe it or not, going to eBay and finding the card and buying it. But then that triggered a project to replace equipment because it's a system that it costs $100,000 an hour if it's actually not running. So they are the challenges. Is the legacy systems. Is a very, very common to see in OT environments. The other thing is that they're designed to run all the time, and for us to be able to remediate, execute, make any changes, is not as simple as, okay, that's it. We're just going to replace it with the next. No, you have to create a specific project. In some cases, there is a Windows, what we call a shutdown window, where you have a very limited amount of time to make those changes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because that's actually how it is. They're designed to run for 30 years, and then you can make changes, but it has to be small changes that can fit in that window. That actually shutdown process is actually also driven by a project. So you have a specific task, and then they will be controlled by saying, hey, I need to install a new firmware version for this specific card or replace this card. But then if the process, the asset that they need to change this is part of the testing of some of the other tasks within the items of the shutdown process, is like they're going to tell you, unfortunately, you have to wait another year for the next shutdown window to replace it, because we can't afford to risk the testing of this change that we're making that is more beneficial for the business, or is driven by protecting people because it's actually adding more safety. So you can imagine that all the design, longevity design, all these different challenges when it comes to modifying and updating systems, it just keeps dragging, and that's why we see now so many legacy systems. Sorry, it's a long story, but it's a good story.
I love the story. I mean, I used to get frustrated when I thought I had long change windows in finance, but it doesn't even compare to what you're talking about. So I just have a question before we go into the next part. I have a question about this. So as you gave an example, right? These plants, they're designed with very long lifespans. Right? You mentioned sort of example is 30 years, right? So I see it's kind of there's two challenges here. You have securing the legacy environment, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of been running for up to 30 years. But then also when you're securing the new plant you're building, you almost need to look 30 years in advance and kind of plan for that from a security perspective. Have I got that right?
Yeah, well, that's about it. And some of the systems that you're gonna find to achieve that, they are behind in when it comes to the implementation of standard for Ethernet, for instance. So I can tell you that I had to when I was actually implementing IC 62443, network segmentation. I was actually creating the zones and the conduit just to make sure that I had a whitelisting, policy in the communications between devices. And I just give you an example of how critical or how challenging, as I say, is to implement security in legacy systems. So this specific vibration controller, one of the most important part, business critical, because if it measures the vibration of the operations, and if something goes wrong, then it trips the system because we want to protect people. So they didn't implement gateways. So you have a IP address and mask. You didn't have a gateway. So you couldn't even, direct the traffic across to the firewall, let alone, how you block it, how you implement the policy if you can't let it communicate to the gateway, right? And you can imagine, okay, well, what do we do? I mean, we're going to have to risk assessment. You create the risk assessment and try to figure out what do you do? And then you have a really nice whitelisting policies, everything segmented, and that one VLAN that goes across the whole thing. It's like, you can imagine some of the complexity that comes when it's trying to implement. And going back to your question, so you try to actually design around the security needed in the long term, but you have to create risk assessments that lets you basically interact with what you have and work with what you have, and create and minimize the risks, and implementing the solution accordingly, okay, with what you have. So sometimes you don't have an option.
Yep.
And then you have to then basically then isolate it in a way, but the communication needs to flow because it's needed in the process.
Yeah, if you've got something on the network and you can't define the gateway, I mean, it might as well not be on the network, right? You can't talk to anything.
Exactly.
So,
but you need it because your SCADA servers, your DCS, everything in the HMI, they need to retrieve information. Sometimes the logic, the strategy that is around the safety system needs to communicate in a normal situation. Is hardwired. They communicate hardwired when it's safety. But when it comes to knowing the status, they needs to be on the network so that the SCADA system or the DCS needs to pull information to understand where it's at. And it's a requirement. You have to have it regardless.
Yep. So before we get on to talking about zero trust, I want to go back to something that you said about how, again, the plant manager. Forgive me if I've got sort of the title wrong. Sort of, again, what they care about, right? But when I'm reading the security news, right, we see a lot of coverage about attacks on manufacturing plants, right, on energy and utilities organizations, and this kind of real concern that attackers are now targeting sort of critical national infrastructure, right? And not necessarily the data side to steal data, but actually to disrupt services or disrupt production. Does that not resonate with the sort of the plant managers? And is that not something that's a concern?
It is definitely a concern, but it's not their concern, okay? Because they are not the security tool, the security people. They are not in charge of security. Until now, they haven't been accountable, to basically provide security, okay? Of course, they are concerned about being disrupted, the operations being disrupted, okay? but they rely on the design of the network, and the vendor saying this is actually was designed with security in mind. But the reality is that they are not really concerned because it's not their scope. So nowadays, with Industry 4.0, for instance, that's actually changing because the CISOs are becoming accountable. And because of that, they are becoming more, stakeholders from an OT's perspective. And then that then trickles down into the plant managers and engineering team to say, well, it's not an option anymore. Okay, you need to help me help you in a way, and that concept is starting to resonate a lot more. Because we can see the effects, across, and the CISOs are actually making sure that communication is passed on to onto the team, and they start helping towards the security and the processes that I need to follow.
Understood.
It's
So
still
with
different. It's still different process. Like, it's still different. Yeah, I understand, but safety and production is first, and then I get to security later.
Yep. No, I completely understand, and that resonates. So with this sort of move towards Industry 4.0, far more integration between sort of the IT and the OT sides of organizations, and we're seeing a lot of real adoption of zero trust strategies, right, across verticals globally. Firstly, what does zero trust mean to you as a practitioner? And then secondly, what does it mean in that space that you operate in?
Yeah. Look, it is very important and relevant, and I think one of the motivators from an OT perspective, especially when it comes to engineering team and plant managers, there is a very very well known benefit when it comes to zero trust. Having a platform that allows you to to provide policies, that allows you to validate the communications, that allows you to securely manage devices with the OT. It resonates very, very well. In fact, I myself have deployed several zero trust strategies into on the LT environments, and the benefit is that the plant managers, they well, first of all, they want to give the a way for systems managed by vendors to be able to come in and then provide maintenance, diagnostics, calibrations to their systems. But they want to do it securely. They want to understand when it happens, who is doing it, how long it's happening. So that is actually very appealing to them because, well, first of all, they get a notification, someone wants to connect. He decides how long they want to connect to that specific device, most likely to be an engineer workstation or a drive or anything that is actually within the OT network that it needs, maintenance. So that allows then third-party vendors to come securely into the OT network and then being monitored, being recorded, being validated. So that resonates really well because it's all part of the management of change process. Is becoming part of that process, and they can actually be basically tracked very well.
And how are you seeing adoption? Because I think that's a great example of a perfect use case for zero trust. What are you seeing is in the OT space? What are you seeing as sort of the rate of adoption of zero trust for use cases? Is it a real sort of organizations sort of having real programs, or is it still fairly immature compared to other verticals?
So I was actually surprised that it depends on the industry. Okay, when you talk about oil and gas, for instance, is a must. Okay, it is no question. So the adoption rate is very, very high. Mining is following behind. Transport and energy, is still trying to mature. Manufacturing is trying to mature on that as well. Okay. But you can actually see that there is a push, and there is a really good adoption, from a zero trust methodology to protect the networks. Okay.
And those verticals where, like, for example, you mentioned energy and utilities and mining.
Yeah.
What is driving the accelerated adoption there? Is it like regulatory requirements, or is it just the fact that their concern of the threats?
It's a bit of both.
Hmm.
Okay. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of also, I will also add in the operational benefits. Okay. So we have then threats, and they want to make sure that, they have internally their own systems that they are maintaining, or have the security policies, and they are
Hmm.
only the ones that are accessing all the devices within the OT network. And then that then, of course, then protects from, a third party having an unknown,
Hmm.
device, asset, laptop connected to the network that they know about. So that then removes that concern. Um, and then you have compliance as well. So,
Hmm.
just to make sure that they comply. It depends on the country that you're in. So you have NIS2 in Europe, and
Yep.
then, you have NERC and others in here in the US. But that's actually also become more important, because it's
Hmm.
actually the regulation is kicking in, and then they need to actually have those processes in place. But then operations, as I mentioned before, operations, because again, IT and OT convergence is actually, amongst us, and it's
Hmm.
important, because the biggest issue at the moment is, IT and OT needs to merge.
Mm.
Because there's a lot of systems in the IT network that are nowadays used, to provide reports, scheduling,
Hmm.
monitor production, and all these things that they need basically to connect
Yep.
into OT environment to pull that information in. So that's actually becoming inevitable. And then when that, merging of the two networks become more obvious, and we're talking about, legacy systems, so the attack surface increases,
Mm.
too greatly. And then having the zero trust, you know, platform or framework will actually, you know, minimize the risks
Hmm.
across all the different scenarios that we can
Hmm.
think of, like you were saying, stealing data, ransomware, or any other attack vector that can
Hmm.
can can be exploited.
So before we talk about the legacy, the challenges with applying zero trust to legacy infrastructure, right? Just let's just because you touched on that need for the IT and OT to increasingly converge.
Yeah.
What are the cybersecurity challenges, threats, risk, whatever, however you want to phrase it, that organizations are concerned about as that integration accelerates?
So, well, first of all, is the know-how.
Hmm.
Okay, so when it comes to IT and OT networks are very different. As I mentioned before, OT networks are designed with executing a specific task only.
Hmm.
IT is completely the opposite. IT will actually provide tools and systems and processes that
Hmm.
are designed to increase the efficiency of people. Okay, as such, and they essentially the philosophy between the two networks are completely opposite.
Mm.
So the biggest concern is that that philosophy clashes as soon as we start opening the OT networks into OT
Hmm.
networks, and that's a big challenge. Helping IT people understand the requirements of OT, because again they're not familiar with it. Also understanding the dynamics of devices within OT network and how they need to behave, what systems need to communicate to each other, how we can achieve that segmentation. And it's a very difficult, and a very steep learning curve to basically implement that information, or those mechanisms into the OT environment, and of course getting the buy-in, from a manufacturing point of view, or from a OT process point of view, to implement these processes, right? So there's so many challenges in here because of the nature of the networks.
Mm-hmm. And just to inquire about those challenges just a bit further, obviously in other verticals, the whole sort of cloud transformation, digital transformation is a huge driver, right? And massive concerns about how do we secure applications, workloads as they move into cloud. Is this a real concern in the OT sector as well, or is the focus much more on that OT IT convergence at this stage?
Look, to be honest, we are driven when it comes to new technologies and pushing new technologies into OT environments. We are driven by the vendors, okay? And if the vendors don't support it, it's simply we won't go there. We will not take that path. When it comes to digital transformation, depending on the industry, depending on the manufacturer that are actually developing these systems, you might or might not have the possibility, to install a SCADA server into hypervisor, or hosting that into the cloud, right? Because there is the technology is not there yet, or the vendor doesn't offer it. Okay, so because of that, then I don't think that's a driver. The driver will be financial. The driver will be reducing the footprint, the using the managing costs, the production costs, but not so much about security.
Understood. So let's go back to sort of zero trust. And what are the challenges with adopting a zero trust strategy when you have so much legacy infrastructure?
So look, the challenges are basically, how do you implement it? How do you basically are able to put those policies in place when you have to make so many changes? As I mentioned before, some of the legacy systems do not support the requirements, the technology that is needed to implement zero trust. That's one. Number two, legacy systems might not have the performance. They definitely don't have the capability to authenticate or validate what policies have been put in place. These and of course, how we have time to implement it. So how finding that window to make the changes, to restructure or redefine or redesign the network, so that we can, implement the network changes that are required, to make zero trust work. So that's basically the challenges that we face.
So when organizations ask you for your advice and say, okay, I want to adopt a zero trust strategy to secure my IT/OT environment, how do you guide them on where to start, how to start?
So obviously this communication, you need to be very honest. But there is always the boundary. You start with the boundary and then start, going deeper into the systems, right? So basically you can establish a DMZ, for instance, without having to make too many changes of your team network. And then from there, then try to find the path into the different systems to start achieving, that zero trust, methods of securing the network. You have to be very creative. You have to sort of understand the network, gain the visibility, understand how they communicate to each other, and then start making decisions, risk assessments. Again, communication is always important. Express the benefits from an operations perspective, as I mentioned before, and try to get the buy-in from an operations perspective, because they know the processes, they know what is what the capability is from a process point of view to start implementing the systems. It's not an easy task. You just have to break it down to, okay, let's just create the visibility first. Let's understand what devices we need to protect. Let's understand the business critical devices, and then isolate those business critical devices, and then implement zero trust, and then start expanding across as a programmatic process until you get to the end. It's not going to be a very small journey or short journey. It's going to be a long journey, but if we do it step by step, at least we can gain the first goal, which is secure the network, and then the second, and then continue on until we finish protecting the whole network.
Yeah, I love how you express that and the way you summarize that, because I think that is the real path towards actually seeing measurable improvements in security, right? Rather than, and as you said, for all the challenges that exist in those environments, trying to do anything on a massive scale is pretty much impossible. So you need to,
unless you have a greenfield project, brownfield projects, it's impossible.
Is it just kind of getting down as you kind of go from like that real macro view, right? And you kind of continue to refine. Do you see a opportunity to leverage like apply zero trust sort of security principles to things like control messages, so that like an attacker couldn't, let's say, hijack a controller and essentially put in sort of illegal messages? And apologies, I have the terms all wrong. So
it's okay. But look, the answer is yes. Okay, the answer is definitely yes. So I think as vendors mature into the cybersecurity, reality and the requirements, what we haven't seen before is vendors are starting to design around security. Okay, so they're starting to look at ways to authenticate changes, controller changes, making sure that they can authenticate. They start looking at encrypting the protocols that are in charge to make those changes. But right now, there are systems that are becoming available that they can actually be put in line, okay, where you have then a device that you put in line, and then that device then connects to the PLC network, and then any configuration that it needs to be done through the network from an engineer workstation to the PLCs, then that communication needs to be authenticated, and they use zero trust, to authenticate, to provide access control, to understand, to the policies of who can make the changes, what changes this person can make, and so forth. Rather, it can actually be very, very segregated in terms of gaining access to controlling the systems. Yeah.
So almost like almost the equivalent like a WAF for those.
Correct.
Right. So just kind of as we move forward, we talked a bit about sort of the adoption of zero trust strategies in a number of industries, and we kind of see like a different approaches by which in various regions this step forward is taking place. You've got obviously the direction from in the case of the US, you have that direction to go and adopt a zero trust strategy, whereas let's say in the EU we're taking much more of a compliance based approach. what are your thoughts on like the pros cons of those approaches, and what do we need to accelerate this?
Yeah, so it all depends on basically, the governments and the countries and the regulations that they feel comfortable with. Okay. Um, so you can actually see in some countries, like you said, we have better resources, better understanding of the requirements, and we, we see, for instance, the US, are adopting zero trust a bit more, like you said, and then Europe compliance a bit more. But the reality is that the more we can do to secure systems, the better. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
compliance. In my opinion, compliance, a framework is a great way to start for
Mm-hmm.
those. Because it's when you look at the frameworks, some of the frameworks are designed to take you by the hand to actually start putting processes in place to start securing your systems. Okay, so and that's great. That's a great start. But you need to actually be a bit more thorough when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to then controlling. And I would say that we can't really separate one of each other. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
because some of these frameworks, the requirement is authentication,
Mm-hmm.
but zero trust goes above and beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there is a lot more than authentication. Is authentication and validation
Mm-hmm.
of what basically, or who is actually accessing, not only from a user perspective, but from a device perspective, and that's basically a step forward,
Mm-hmm.
and it requires more maturity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but in my opinion, they're both required. From to have better chances to be protected. But from an operational point of view, to be honest, um, I like the fact that you can, have management of change processes that can actually link to zero trust
Mm-hmm.
to basically monitor and validate changes that are being made on the network,
Yeah.
or the devices or the process. To have more control
Mm.
and to be more thorough when it comes to productivity and process integrity.
That's a really interesting take. I've never heard anyone say that about applying zero trust to the actual the process itself,
Hmm.
and using that as a driver to kind of drive better practice, right? So it's almost
Yeah,
you're not necessarily driving a new technology adoption, etc., but you're just saying I'm not going to allow things to creep in as part of the change process at this stage.
correct.
I
And
really
that's
like that.
that's the part I like the most. Yeah.
So just kind of as we get close to wrapping up, if you're able to provide this perspective, how do you think the critical national infrastructure space today is geared up to survive a large scale cyber attack? What is your confidence in that?
It's a very difficult question as well. But look, they have the resources. They have the frameworks. They have the I guess the good ideas. Okay, to basically protect systems. But the reality is that you know when it comes to having people resources that need to implement these, people that need to respond from a specific incident, we're still developing that. It's still early stages
Hmm.
for them to be in a great position to um, you know survive, I guess. I don't know if that's a good word, but to be able to respond and remediate a large scale incident. Okay. They do, you can actually see that there's a lot of work in place. There is a lot of procedures. There is a lot of mechanisms and frameworks. Um, but if it's a large scale, it will be very, very difficult.
Hmm.
Just to give an example of Log4j, you
Yeah.
know, we work, we all work towards that as a community. Um, but we were in a way very isolated from each other. So
Hmm.
everyone was actually doing their own thing and trying to survive independently. Okay. And some organizations were more ready, but still have a lot of work to do, and some of them are still trying to recover. So it's just that example of, do we have what we need? Yes, but can we actually implement what we said we need to do? I don't think we're ready yet.
So I like the way you phrase that, because I think you're presenting a glass half full picture, and and sort of you're optimistic that we have almost like the tools in place, and we now need to sort of drive adoption. And you spoke about really working as a community rather than in isolation, which is, I think, so important to better security. So looking into the future, Carlos, right? I think if we don't talk about AI on any conversation, then like no one will
No,
the
no,
SEO
listen,
SEO will be trashed, right? So like how do you see the relevance of AI in the OT space, right? Not just from a cybersecurity perspective, but in terms of what like its benefits towards operations, and then of course, right, its use in securing that.
Yeah. So look, AI is a very, very powerful tool, right? So, and, so long you have the data, you can actually, take advantage of the results that I give you, the automation, the reporting. So there's a lot of benefits when it comes to AI. And, I specifically, we basically use it, in our production system to, to correlate information, to create reports, to, be more in tune of efficiency, okay, and create basically manage the data in such a way that the results are being positive. But unfortunately, there is always the other side of the coin, right? So it needs to be actually used for a good use. It needs to be used to benefit. We already starting to see AI in OT environments specifically, use to take advantage of vulnerabilities. To take advantage, and this is actually, we have already seen some attacks, cyber attacks that are using AI and exploiting unfortunately vulnerabilities from these legacy systems. They don't even have to log in to the machines. They use AI to understand how to basically exploit that vulnerability. So but at the same time, then we can actually use some of the tools using AI to fight against that. So I guess my position is, it is great so long we use it good, in the way it's designed. It's like everything, right? It's like we can use it to improve production, we can use it to improve security, but at the same time we need to be very careful, because if it's not implemented properly, and it's actually it sounds cliche, but if it goes in the bad hands, in the wrong hands, then it can actually be, it can basically work against us.
Absolutely right. And I think you touched on that, in that AI in the hands of an attacker gives them the ability to sort of have kind of a far more detailed visibility and analysis that would sort of, they'd have to spend a lot of cycles on doing today. So I think if I think about this from a zero trust perspective, it's then how do we ensure that their view in the environment is as limited as possible, so that they can hoover up as little information as possible to drive that analysis?
We basically segmenting every possibility, from authentication point of view, so they don't have, they have to be authenticated, so the vulnerabilities cannot be exploited, because you need to get in. From a business critical point of view, you can't get to the place that you need to get to actually affect production, because you have zero trust methods to avoid the spread. Okay, you have that network cemented. It's like, well, you get there, but you can't go forward if you get there. that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, right, I think we could carry on for a long time. I'm learning so much today. Let's wrap with something fun, Carlos. What is your favorite zero trust analogy? So if Carlos was describing zero trust to a 5-year-old Carlos, how would you describe it?
Look, it's like the security part, right? So you can design, and I'm gonna just change my analogy for a minute, right? You can design a house, okay? And this is actually how I explain security to my sons. You can design a house, and the house has windows and doors, okay? Are you secure? And say, yeah, okay. What if I break the window? Ah, what if I pick the lock? Ah, so what else can you do? Okay, well, you can put bars in your windows. Okay, what if I can actually bring an angle grinder and then angle grinder the bars and then break the window? Ah, well, you can actually put a roller door. You know, so that's actually what I see. Zero trust. It's a it's a full set of methodologies to ensure that your house is secure by segmenting the security processes, right? So you actually have to define and again risk assess and understand how you secure and put those controls in place. And one of those controls is video cameras, for instance, to understand who is accessing.
Yeah.
And then the other control is just to have a very secure authentication system that allows you to get into the house. And then once you're in the house, then you have the cameras to actually see what you're doing. Okay. But then you get into a room and then you only have access to that room. That's your room. You sit down, you lie down and sleep in there, but you try to go to your brother's room and you can't because you're not allowed. That's actually
I love it. It feels like you actually have zero trust conversations with your sons, which I
Yeah,
which I really like. So, Carlos, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you for such like an enlightening overview of security in the OT environment, the challenges, the future, the relevance of zero trust. It's been eye-opening for me, who actually has no understanding of that environment. So I really appreciate that. And for the listeners, if you haven't already had the chance, Armis recently published a fantastic research report, The Anatomy of Cybersecurity, a dissection of 2023's attack landscape. I highly encourage you all to go and check that out. Carlos, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun. Thank you, Raghu, for you made it very fun. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.